Good evening. I have it on the authority of no less a person than the Auditor General that the Pacific region of the Fisheries Department of the nation is in a mess. And I also know the fears of fishermen on the West Coast that the federal government is going to use salmon stocks given to native fishermen as a way of getting out of land claims. I'm going to try these two questions and some others on Tom Siddon, the Fisheries Minister. But here's Ted with the rundown.
Should doctors be allowed to practice medicine wherever they want? The BC Supreme Court says no. Is this the beginning of the end of Medicare in this province? The doctors say yes. With Webster tonight, Dr. Robert Conn, President of the Canadian Association of Interns and Residents. Dr. David Mathews, President of the Professional Association of Residents and Interns. And Dr. Christyanne Maxson, a Kelowna physician who has been denied a billing number. But first, BC fishermen make up our fourth largest industry, but are they fishing each other out of business? The Pierce report says there are too many boats chasing too few fish, and the Auditor General agrees. In the studio with Webster, Tom Siddon, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Mr. Siddon, you will agree with me that the Auditor General's report is a broad condemnation of bad planning, poor priorities, a bit of wastage in your department on the West Coast.
Yes, I think his report of this past autumn definitely was, but it's a couple of years out of date.
Have you done anything to clean it
We've done
up?
a considerable amount on several of the matters that the Auditor General raised. For example, from the time I was appointed minister, we began a top-down overhaul of the department. A department whose budget had doubled in 5 years from 300
to
to
600
million.
They were to blame for all the mess.
I don't want to sound too partisan, Jack, but that's exactly the point.
Have you still got 900 engines for 600 boats? Have you still got 300 boats for 200 operational staff? Little
Jack,
things like that.
The last 2 years, we've had the most productive benefit and income from the fishery in Canadian history, and there's no case to be made at the present time for buying out fishing boats that we helped to put into the water in the first place.
I'm talking about your staff boats.
Oh, our own patrol
You've
boats.
got 200 boats.
We are rationalizing...
300 boats for 200 operational employees.
Well, but they're considering every little dinghy there. We are integrating our fleet, reducing waste, eliminating personnel we don't need in the Pacific region in September.
Fair enough. I'll take your word for it. It was all the fault of the Liberals and you're cleaning it up.
Right, and we're cleaning up the mess.
Let's go to the big one, which the Pacific, what do you call it, Pacific Fishermen's Defense Alliance are still incredibly worried about. That was the bylaws passed by Crombie, by the Gitscan, and which the fishermen on the West Coast think is a way to piece off the Indians for their land claims by giving them the total control of the river fishery on the Skeena.
Well, that isn't exactly the case, but Mr. Crombie did not choose to disallow those bylaws last March. And they were then suspended by way of an injunction brought in by the Pacific Defense Alliance and the BC Attorney General. That injunction still stands, and those bylaws, which would have allowed the Gitscan, Wet'suwet'en and Tribal Council to sell fish for profit, those bylaws are in suspension at the present time.
Well, let me test your stand on it. Had you been Crombie at the time, would you have disallowed the bylaws?
When Crombie and I discussed the matter, I tried to persuade him that this would constitute a precedent and that we should have a policy or a principle first, a point which he came to agree with later when we met with all of the affected groups here in Vancouver last May.
But you don't want to give the whole of the resource fishery to any Indian group,
and in fact, if we find ways to involve fish deals in the comprehensive land claims process, it's got to be by way of market initiatives. That is to say, no one's property should be expropriated or their right and given to another party, notwithstanding the concerns and the aspirations.
I don't want
to
nag you about this, but that bylaw gave the Tribal Council and the Skeena the power to manage, control and harvest all the fishery resources, right?
Well, that was what they aspired to, and in fact,
but you're against
my
that.
position is that as Minister of Fisheries, I must run the fishery on behalf of all the people of Canada.
Briefly, on the Malouf report on sealing.
Yes, sir.
Are you going to allow them to kill the little white coats?
There's no longer any market for the taking of those white pelts, those white coats from baby seals. And as far as we're concerned, that industry and that practice is dead, and we will not in any way encourage its rejuvenation.
But you will harvest the adult seals?
Or older seals for pelts, for leather, for seal parts, seal meat, because that was a long-established industry, both on the Atlantic coast and in northern Canada among the native people, and we want to encourage its resurrection.
What's that little fellow who's going to sit on the ice and stop you? His
Mr.
name
Mowat,
escapes me.
Farley Mowat. He says that if we go ahead with the cull of the gray seals, the world will fall upon my shoulders. Well, so be it if that is what comes to pass.
Couple of calls today on why you have doubled the commercial license fees from 400 to 800, 800 to 1600, and made no real explanation of it.
Oh, I have explained it over and over again, and I'd be happy to do so again, Jack.
Briefly, you need the money.
In 10 years, we put over $250 million into the Salmon Enhancement Program. These license fee increases will raise $4 million this year against a cost of enhancement of $40 million. So we're asking the fishermen to put up 1/10 of the cost by way of their license fees toward the enhancement of our Pacific salmon. I think that's a fair request.
Matter of fact, it's in the Auditor General's report that of the $250 million you spent on salmonid enhancement, you've recovered less than 10%, and you were supposed to recover a lot more than that.
Well, Jack, it takes at least 2 salmon cycles or 8 years to begin to prove the benefits of the investment. But it's now 10 years later, not the time when the Auditor General prepared that report. And last year we earned $50 million in landed value from the enhancement program alone. And that went into the pockets of fishermen. And we feel it's only fair to ask them this year to put back $2 million in exchange for the $50 million benefit they got this year.
For 1,000 years sitting in this place, more or less, I've heard everybody tell me that we have far too many boats catching, far too many fishing boats chasing too few fish on the coast. You've cut it down from 6,600, the government says, to 4,400. You still get the same catch. And you're still going to continue buying back these boats for fishermen, which we guarantee
not the government of
loans.
which I'm a part. We cannot afford to buy back fishing boats when we need funds to grow more salmon for the Salmonid Enhancement Program. And you know, the ridiculous part of this is that the government of Canada guaranteed the loans by which those boats were built. Why should the taxpayer help the fishermen to build more efficient, powerful boats and then buy them back from it? How ridiculous.
How much did we pay to buy back? I know people have had $90,000, $100,000 loans on which they defaulted and which you picked up the tab to get the banks off their back. How much did we spend
Under
on
the
that?
Fishery Improvement Loans Act, most of the loans which were guaranteed and went into default were on the West Coast, and it was in the tens of millions of dollars. I can't give you the specific number.
You're still buying back the
But,
one, of course,
you know, some of those very well-financed, very impressive boats were financed with money guaranteed by the Government of Canada. Now we should buy them back?
Sport fishing.
Yes, sir.
Double the license last November.
Also, we think sport fishermen should start to pay a reasonable share. Again, $2 million out of 40 we're asking the sport fishermen to pay by doubling their license fee from $5 to $10 next year. You know, $10 to go fishing for a whole year. I think most fishermen would agree that's not an unreasonable request.
But last count, you had 18 to 20 million cans of smelly tuna. That's right, isn't it? Smelly.
Well, we don't have it. It belongs to Starkist.
Starkist,
That's
yes.
right.
And I'm not going to go over your forebears' problems.
No, we shouldn't, and I don't want to repeat them.
No, I hope not. But what are you going to do? It tasted bad and it smelled badly and there was a big fuss about it, and you still got 20 million cans sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Starkist has.
We have been re-inspecting that tuna under conditions which they agreed to. We're testing 100 cans for the production of every day's product, and we have approved some and rejected some of that supply, and it's up to Starkist now to get on with releasing to the market the product which is acceptable according to the law.
Did you taste and smell any of the cans
I sure
yourself?
have, yes sir.
Did you eat it?
I wasn't too happy with some of it.
But
I did taste it. I didn't devour a whole can.
One other thing that I was to ask you. You're scrapping the Ministers' Advisory Council on the West Coast?
Not yet, but we have.
You plan to?
We are going to replace it with a policy advisory group and add a special group to allocate the commercial salmon. But the policy advisory group, which we're calling PARC, or Pacific Area Regional Council, will provide direct advice to me. It'll be a small body of about 12 eminent persons, respected and broadly representative of the industry.
All from the employer's side?
Oh, not at all. There will be union representation there, gill knitters, trollers, sports fishermen, and native people.
And they're going to advise you on allocating catches?
No. That process will occur at the 3 allocation committees, but I need a policy group to advise me on questions as to whether or not the native people should be able to sell fish caught in the river, whether they should be able to use monofilament nets, whether we should allow one fishing boat to use more than one type of gear. Whole list of policy problems which I need their advice on.
The old advisory committee couldn't do.
It degenerated into a group where the majority stayed and the disappointed left, and where they wrangled over who got how many fish.
Okay,
We're going to change that.
Your calls to Tom Siddon, Minister of Fisheries, who promises all kinds of things, immediately after the break.
Only those I can deliver.
Well, here's an old friend of yours. I tried to catch him earlier in the day, but here he is now. Paddy Green, go ahead to Minister.
Good old Paddy.
Hi, Tom.
How are you doing, Paddy?
I was interested in your comments about degeneration on Mac, but my question was that on Friday, the Toronto Star rated ministers of the Crown on their performance, and I see that you got an F. Was this due to your action on the West Coast, East Coast, or both?
Well, that's a provocative question, Paddy. I think I've turned the corner after the end of my first year, and Mr. Pickford had something to say about that a few weeks ago. I don't particularly concern myself with what the Toronto Star believes. If we're doing a good job as Minister of Fisheries, we're making a lot of people upset from time to time.
Have you a question on the fishery, Paddy?
No, that's fine.
Fair enough, I'll let you go. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested in this doubling of licenses. It's,
yes, sir.
Interesting when on the East Coast they'll throw $500 million, which went in about 3 or 4 years ago into the East Coast fishery. Canada, they put in, I guess it was $500 million. The farmers are getting $1 billion, but when it comes to the West Coast, it seems like we're paying it back. The other thing I'm wondering about is I've got an A license, so now a little 36-foot boat. Now mine goes from $400 a year to $800 a year. But for my native friends who fish on their AI licenses, they're out there the same days as me. They pay $20 a year. I'd like his reaction to that and how he justifies that.
Okay, sir, on your first question, we are trying to bring good management practices and a degree of cost recovery to the Atlantic coast fishery to the same extent we are on this coast, and there are certain advantages that we have here that they don't have in terms of government assistance. I mentioned the Fishery Improvement Loans Act a little while ago. But you can be sure that when the fishing industry starts to pay dividends to the fishermen, that it's going to be my approach that they should pay something back to the Treasury.
Fishermen don't always have bad years. We run stories regularly about fantastic catches, herring and sockeye.
Have you ever heard a fisherman admit to having a good year?
No, they always want a bigger boat though every year, don't they?
Absolutely.
Oh no, they're
what about
years,
just a minute? What about the licenses? $20 for Indian fishermen and $800 for him.
Many years ago, a special category of fishing license was established for Native people called an AI license, because the Native people didn't want to see their share of the licenses eroded. So those licenses can't be bought and sold in the free market, and therefore they've been allowed to have those licenses renewed at a much lower rate than the other commercial fishermen. We will contemplate changing that, and I've been discussing it with Native people. It's the type of issue we will discuss at this policy council.
Fair enough. If I'm a non-Indian fisherman and I've got $800 license, I can sell my boat with the A license on it for God knows how much.
That's right. And the native fisherman cannot
do that. Good point. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm wondering if the minister could elaborate on this park group that they're starting up. I gather there's about a dozen representatives, one for each gear type, and I don't know, I've heard a breakdown with as many as 3 native representatives and 1 or 2 sports, all with a variety of interests. I think there might be too many there to really agree on anything concrete.
Okay, can you give me the breakdown of park?
Well, first of all, this is not to be a group that makes decisions, but a group that sits, and it is not to be a group that brings the vested interests of their own organizations. It's a group that comes with the power to act and advise me on what policy should be. About 5 or 6 members will represent the commercial fishery, gillnet, seine, troll sectors, union, and the processing sector. There will be a neutral chairman or woman. There will be about 3 representatives of the sport fish and 3 of the native community. The reason why we're not giving dominance to the commercial sector is because they would dominate all the decisions, and that wouldn't give the other 2 parties a strong enough voice.
Have you picked the chairperson yet?
I have not yet.
Thank you. Go
You're
ahead.
all good candidate, Jack.
Not me. Go ahead from Gibson's.
Yes, Jack, I'd like to ask Tom Siddon
Yes, sir.
what they plan on doing about the harbor seal population. there is about 4,000 seals in Howe Sound, which take approximately 20% of sports fishermen's salmon off their line. And there is no way we can protect ourselves.
Okay, hold on. Are you shooting them just now?
Huh?
Do you shoot them now?
If I can, yes, I will every chance, but it's illegal.
Okay. That's why I asked you.
Sir, this is a very sensitive problem, and there is a concern on the West Coast about the overpopulation of sea lions and harbor seals. We waited upon the Maloof report to decide what to do about reducing seal populations, and I have to face that kind of tough decision now. Certainly on the East Coast, there is a recommendation.
Never mind the East Coast. What about the West Coast?
And if all of the groups in BC can come together and advise that we do it here, I'll be happy to listen seriously to their recommendation.
If Park and your committee comes up and says,
they came and said it, and
shoot the sea lions.
well, I guess we'd have to deal with Greenpeace.
Hey,
but
Jack, are you still there?
Yeah.
If the BC Wildlife Federation puts any input into it, what are we going to get out of this? I'd like to know that. Our licenses are doubling too, our costs have tripled, and I would like to see the input into this.
Well, just wait and see what happens in that one. I haven't got that much time for the minister tonight, unfortunately. Go ahead, please.
Yes, a quick question, Mr. Siddon.
Yes, sir.
Why does it always appear that you're cutting back the fishermen on their licenses and the amount that they can catch? You're chasing up the Fraser River with rifles after Indian people that want to feed their kids, and the sports fishermen have such a huge majority of the fish, like 85% or something like that. It's I'm a little bit ignorant on the subject. Maybe you could clarify it
well,
for me.
I don't want to confirm what you just said, sir, but the commercial sector often argues for the strongest voice because they admit they catch 90 to 95% of the salmon, not the sport fishermen, who gets a paltry few. In the Gulf of Georgia, I think some 200,000 Chinook salmon were taken by the sport fishery last year.
Okay,
so that the sport share of the actual catch is small in proportion to the total
it's only
fish
actually
landed.
of concern in the Gulf, isn't
That's
it?
just in the Gulf, yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Changing the subject a bit, how are we making out with the French government and the islands off the East Coast there?
Oh, well, in fact, Prime Minister Chirac will be meeting the Prime Minister next week, and that subject will be discussed.
Have they established no fishing limit on the Magdalen Islands?
Around the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, Magdalen are ours. Around the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, there's a disputed zone. The French claim 200 miles to the south into the Gulf, into the mouth of the St. Lawrence. We claim that as ours, and that matter will have to be decided before the International Court.
Go ahead, please.
Jack, I've got two questions, actually. One, I like the idea of a body to advise the minister that haven't got their own personal axe to grind. I think this is a good step forward. I think that it should be diversified a little bit in terms to include the sports fishery in terms of the community advisors that are going to all this work to create the fish, and all the sporting clubs that are actually putting fish in the water. I think these guys, that if they get off their, that have shown the willingness to go out and raise fish on their own, are a vital part of the people that to advise the minister. And secondly, when is he going to do something about what we call the management group that's setting the numbers of fish for the different rivers? For instance, I run a hatchery in the capacity as a volunteer. I must say it's a little different than the normal one. But I've been trying for 5 to 6 years to get spring salmon for a particular river. Can't get them, and yet I see some of the brood stock from rivers located in the area we got going to other areas. We run the hatchery. I'm limited in the number of fish I could do. I could probably do 10 times to 20 times more fish than I am doing, and yet I can't get permission to do it. I'll hang up and listen to your answer.
Well, sir, when you spoke of the valuable role of these advisors, I certainly recognize, and we, all British Columbians, ought to be thankful for the free contribution of time and resources by many community groups, high school groups, the rod and gun clubs,
You mean volunteer hatcheries?
in helping with these enhancement projects, small-scale enhancement projects throughout BC.
But you can't get any fish.
Well, there aren't enough eggs to go around, and this is some rivers aren't as capable of supporting large runs of enhanced salmon as others, but we have to find ways to make more eggs available on the Chinook stocks, spring salmon in particular, and You know, one way to get that is through a lot of the eggs that are caught in the native food fishery that are lost and left on the riverbanks. And you know, this gets into a sensitive issue that Patty Green would be concerned about. Should the natives not be allowed to take those eggs and raise the smolts so they can then be reseeded into the rivers?
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack. I'd like to make an observation and then get Mr. Siddon's response. The natural resources of which fish and trees of Canada really belong to the people of Canada. Now, if a logging company wants to log, they pay a fee for each tree they cut. Fishermen don't seem to pay any fee for the fish they catch.
Wasn't there a recommendation that such a thing should happen?
For a long time, and Dr. Peter
Royalty.
Pierce confirmed this, there's a recommendation to impose a landings charge or 5 cents a pound, whatever. We looked at that in the context of the cost to continue the SEP program and found that the cost to collect $3 or $5 million a year for the next 3 years would exceed the money we raised. So we decided to raise license fees instead for the same purpose.
My thanks to Tom Siddon, Minister of Fisheries. I hope the next Auditor General reports backs up your claims of cleaning up the mess on the West Coast.
He better. Thank you, Jack. Good to be here.
Next, the doctors with the problem with the billing numbers. My thanks to Tom Siddon. I'll be back after the break. Yeah, I think that's the way she wants them. Dr. Maxson. Funny name. What do I want now? Oh, I need that little...
Glass of water. That wouldn't be a bad idea. Anybody else? Water, coffee? Water? On the risk of thank you. Giving you a plague.
Oh, I wouldn't want to catch
What's your problem?
I just got over it. You're shiny.
Not bad for a Tory cabinet minister. It's all bullshit anyway. I'm too cynical to be in this job nowadays.
No, you're just cynical enough.
That's why there's 200,000 people watching. Yeah.
It's a really touchy one tonight, and I'll tell you why. Because I think the court decision denying the doctors the billing numbers, and I don't often take this blunt a position, was right. But I have three very outstanding young doctors here who feel that it's not right that they should be denied and that new entries to the profession in British Columbia approved by the college should be denied billing numbers, which means denied the right to practice under MSP. Here I have Dr. Robert Conn, who's the president of the Canadian Association of Interns and Residents. Here I have Dr. David Mathews, the president of the Professional Association of Residents and Interns. And here I have Dr. Christyanne Maxson, from Kelowna, I believe, yes, who was refused a billing number. Gentlemen, I'll start with you, Dr. Conn. When I look at the judge, perhaps we should explain, first of all, that the government tried previously to restrict billing numbers, did it not?
That's correct. Back in 1982, when Premier Bennett was, then Premier Bennett was elected, he came in on a platform of restraint, and he brought in a bill called Bill 24. And it was never passed, but they began implementing it.
And refused to give billing numbers.
Refused to give billing numbers, and a young doctor in Kamloops by the name of Dr. Mia was refused a number. We took the government to court at that time on her behalf, and we won. We came out with a decision by the Chief Justice, Alan McKechnie, and he found that the restriction of billing numbers, the scheme to restrict billing numbers, was so offensive. In fact, he used very colorful language. He said that it was Orwellian, he said that it was draconian, he said that, in his opinion, it was the most severe limitation of an individual's freedom short of imprisonment.
To cut a long story short, the government then began to change the law, and having changed the law, they were able to go to court and finished up with a decision which gave them the right to restrict billing numbers to anyone except someone of their choice. Is that not correct?
That's correct. That's correct. The decision that came down the other day by Justice Lissick, in his opinion, he feels that the Charter of Rights doesn't prevent the government from limiting billing numbers.
And put this to Dr. Mathews. You see, Lissick, Mr. Justice Lissick, compared the doctors to other workers and saying, in the public sector, no one suggests that any level of government is obliged to hire civil servants beyond its perceived needs. You see, that's why I agree with Lissick, because they control the money part, and they must have the right to say, we've got one doctor to 500 people or whatever, enough is enough.
Well, the first thing to say to that is I don't think any government knows how many doctors is too many or how many is enough.
They know how many dollars is too much.
Yes, I quite agree with that. but there are other ways to take care of increased costs rather than limiting the freedoms of young doctors to practice. I think that a young physician doesn't want a guaranteed income, doesn't want the right to work, it just wants a right to a chance to succeed or fail.
But is it not a fact, I'll put this to you too, or to either one of you, and I'll come to Maxine in a minute, that an MSP number under our totally socialized fee-for-service medical coverage is not a license to print money, but it's a license to make a good living right off the top?
No,
Absolutely not.
it's an opportunity to work. It's a chance to work. You know, when Medicare was originated 15 years ago, and in fact, in the last 15 years, governments have been trying to find ways to get doctors to come into Medicare, trying to co-opt them and trying to make them part of Medicare. Here you have a generation of young doctors who believe in Medicare, went into medicine
because of Medicare.
Because of Medicare. They knew that was the system that they were going to be working in, now being locked out.
Dr. Christyanne Maxson, you tell me why it's so unfair and why I'm wrong. About the judge's decision. You think it's a wrong decision. Now, in your own circumstances, you're a qualified doctor. You're presently working where?
In Kelowna and also in Vancouver, filling in for other doctors who are on holidays. That's all I'm allowed to do.
And when you're filling in for doctors, are you billing on their number when you're doing a locum?
I'm using their number, but I have a temporary number with my own billing cards that I send in, but I can't send my cards in when they're sending their cards in. It has to be one or the other.
So you have no future, therefore, as a doctor. How could you be given a number? Can the government give you a number if it wants to?
The government states that if I get hospital privileges and if I get a letter of need from the community stating that I am needed, that they will give me a billing number, but there have been other doctors who have that who haven't got the billing number.
Well, how can you get hospital privileges can you get that without a billing number?
Sure, I have hospital privileges right now in Kelowna to work as an emergency physician.
Could they use this legislation, Dr. Conn or Dr. Mathews or Dr. Maxson, could they use this legislation to direct you to the area of your labor as doctors?
Are you meaning with respect to what type of work you do?
No, I'm saying the short of a doctor in Puscopay, Fort St. John, or whatever.
We have had members, some of our members have called the government and said, look, I'm a licensed physician, I want to work, I want to go somewhere and work full-time. Could you please tell me where I should go? The government has no answer. And they said, well, what should I do? And the government said, well, why don't you just go somewhere, set up, and then call us, and we'll let you know if this is appropriate or not.
But I thought they specifically brought in some of the legislation to be able to say where doctors would go, did they not?
That's what Jim Nielsen said when he brought it in, and you know, this is a piece of legislation that was brought in by the former government. He said that this was designed to send young doctors up north. What came out in the court case was that this wasn't a plan to redistribute doctors. This was a plan to control healthcare costs. In other words, it's a plan to de-insure doctors, to make young doctors go out of Medicare so that only people who can afford to see them can go and see them. It's a plan that, if it's allowed to continue, will destroy Medicare.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
I don't know what to make about that. I can see your problem is really a very human problem. What would you, supposing you could not get a billing number in British Columbia, you would have to use your degree. Where would you use it?
That's difficult. It just happened to me yesterday to realize that I couldn't. I'm not sure. I may go to the States, I may go to Toronto.
But then you've got to sit exams for the States or something.
I've already sat them. I sat them when I was interning. Most of my classmates do because of the billing number situation.
If you go to another province, you don't have to resit your examinations.
No.
How many years was your training as a doctor?
It's still in progress. I'm doing residency training now. It's been 9 years so far.
And yours?
I've been training for 12 years. 12 years. Another 3 to go.
You're a residency in some specialism?
That's correct.
And you?
9.
Well, what can I say to you? You said, well, somebody said that this would force the public into a two-tiered system.
That's right. I mean, Medicare was designed to have everybody in it, both the public and the doctors. Now you've got a system where you've got doctors in, doctors out. That's 2 tiers. You're quite right. Christyanne is not going to become an accountant. She's not going to become a lawyer. She's not going to drive a taxi cab. She's going to find some way to work as a doctor. And because she's young, because she's got the latest techniques, she's going to try. It's going to be hard, and probably she won't be able to do it. But if you lock enough young doctors out, they're going to find ways to make patients that can afford to see them come and see them.
Maybe this is just to provoke you, but in fact there isn't really competition in the medical profession. Wherever you set up, there's always a need for a doctor even if there is overutilization on this fee for service. Is that not so?
There's very real competition. There's very real competition, and you've hit the nail on the head. This is eliminated competition. If you're a doctor in a community and you're not doing a very good job, and there's good doctors and bad doctors, and a young doctor comes in who's prepared to open their office at night, prepared to open their office on the weekend and make house calls, in the system that we used to have, that doctor would be the one that would get the patient.
All right, I'll take another line of defense. Every new doctor added to the MSP billing number adds $250,000 to the cost of Medicare by his very presence in the scheme.
I didn't make $250,000 last year.
No, but the cost of facilities and support and labs and all the rest of it adds, and fees brings it up to $250,000 for every new doctor.
And who is that money spent on? The patient.
Well,
that's right. Every doctor that's added, every time it costs money in the system, that's because a patient's being treated. And that's fulfilling the promise of Medicare. A doctor who has a billing number doesn't make any money. He only makes money if he treats a patient. And patients have to come to the doctor.
Federal government officials show that British Columbia has an overabundance of doctors, one for each 511. Nationally, it's one doctor for 577. We have the highest ratio of doctors in Canada.
The ratio of number of doctors between British Columbia and Canada has remained constant since 1950s. Both numbers have risen slowly over the years, but that difference between Canada and BC has not changed in 30 years. There are also more lawyers per population in British Columbia, more accountants per population in British Columbia.
But if I'm an article student who has labored and toiled to get, I often can't get articling, far less a job as a lawyer.
But you can try. You have the option to go into that community and try and compete for that job, and if you're good enough, you'll get it. Whereas now we don't.
We don't have that option.
We don't have that option.
Frozen out on the outside.
Yes.
Maybe there are too many old doctors in this province who should already have been retired. I'm going to go to, I said that, not my guests. We're going to go to calls now. Have they been unfairly treated? Should everyone who qualifies as a doctor, I almost said from British Columbia, from any medical school in Canada,
any doctor qualified to practice in the province. And we're asking, and I want to make this clear, we're not asking, never have asked for a right to make money. We're asking for a chance to work in the system. And even Judge Lissick admitted that if you can't work in the system, you can't work as a doctor.
After the break. I have Dr. Maxson, I've got Dr. Conn, and I've got Dr. Mathews. And I'm going to put it to you, convince me that you could, if you were practicing as doctors, it would not add to the incredible burden of finances on our backs.
If you're working as a doctor, if Christyanne were to set up her office and open it tomorrow, she has no guarantee that anybody's going to come and see her. Only patients who want to see her can come and see her. And for example, let's look at Kelowna.
No, I'm talking about overall costs. I am the Premier of the province. I've said I'm only going to spend $1.8 billion on health this year, not a nickel more for doctors who might be whatever it is, hundreds of millions of dollars to doctors.
But Mr. Webster, how can I cost the system more money if there's nobody coming in the door? I can't treat any patients unless they're there.
But it's an open-ended system. Utilization gets paid for regardless.
Yeah, but disease is a real entity. People only get sick. In fact, I don't know anybody that likes getting sick.
I thought you were going to tell me that it can be capped so that the government is only committed to X dollars for doctors.
The government
and
already
reduce the share.
The government already has capping.
But they haven't reduced any of the fee for scheduled services amounts.
If they haven't, it's only because utilization hasn't grown to the extent that they're going to do that.
Here is one of your colleagues who was talking to him on the phone yesterday. I'll put him on there now. Go ahead, Doc.
Hello.
It's your turn. Go ahead.
Okay. Listen, I've been following this very closely. I know two of the people there. They'll probably recognize me too. One thing that hasn't come through really clearly is the fact that what really is happening here is a plan to decrease accessibility to doctors. They can't politically tell people not to go to doctors, so by reducing the number of doctors, they'll eventually achieve that end. And that's exactly what's going on, and that's why Dr. Conn's quite correct when he says this is a real threat to Medicare as we know it.
You've explained that very eloquently. We know what happened in Britain, where you have a system of ins and outs. There are people in Medicare, and if you want to get on the waiting list to get treated, then you get on the waiting list. But if you've got money, you go and see the guy that's out.
I've got to jump in again. The British system cannot be compared with the Canadian system because the British system is operated on a per capita basis, not fee-for-service. And per capita socialism doesn't work very well in a country like Britain. But if I'm covered by BUPA, which is causing trouble in Britain now, I can get whatever I want, whenever I want, by paying the insurance fees.
The point of it, though, is that there's ins and outs. There's a system where you have two different tiers.
Yes, low class and high class.
And that's what we're going to end up with here. We have doctors who are in and doctors who are out.
Dr. Whitman, how long have you been qualified?
I've been eligible for about a year and a half. I've actually been seeking a number for about 6 or 7 months now.
It must be terribly discouraging, I do admit. But I'm going to have Duick here tomorrow night. What do you want me to ask him?
Well, you know,
Are you speaking to me?
Speaking to you and my guests.
Well, I want you to ask him why it is that if we're over-doctored, I am being solicited by practices, and more than one, who are desperate for me to join them because they're overworked and they're turning patients away. Why is that the case, then?
Yeah, the government says that there's no need for Christyanne in Kelowna, and yet there are no female doctors in Kelowna who are taking new patients. So if you want to see a female doctor in Kelowna, you can't see one.
That's a good point. And have you applied to the government for a number on that basis?
About 6 times.
And turned down?
Turned down every time.
We have young doctors in northern British Columbia who want to go up there and work. They can't work. Most of the northern communities get serviced by people who go out and practice for 2 or 3 years and then go back and do specialty training. You can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask another question. Thanks very much, Doc.
Nice to talk to you.
One of the great fears of the established medical profession, BCMA or whatever, was that when billing numbers were controlled, you would not be able to sell your practice. Is that inherent in this?
It depends on how the scheme is administered. If the government says that there's a total number of billing numbers and then you can sell your number, then it puts a price on the number. But we've seen situations where people have been told, if you go and buy a practice, it'll increase your chances of getting a billing number. We have a situation of somebody who bought a practice locally here and then didn't get a number. And all those patients that have been going to that practice for years had to go and find new doctors.
That's a big story. I'd like to interview that doctor. I would.
I know another physician that I've spoken with as well that has hospital privileges in Vancouver, has a big practice that needs him to come into it, and has a physician now having the practice who is overworked and desperate to have him. The manpower committee has said, yes, there is a need for your services. The government won't give him a number either.
This just isn't GPs either. In the court case, it came out that there's a clinic in Vancouver that's a family practice clinic that has been trying since this scheme came in to get billing numbers for an obstetrician for their clinic because they have family practice and they deliver babies. They can't get one.
That seems a bit stupid, doesn't it?
Well, it makes it even more clear that the goal of this was to cut healthcare costs.
Jack, right now, the last 2 practices, certainly in Kelowna, that were sold, were both sold to people with billing numbers specifically. I talked to the people who were selling them, and they wanted to keep their billing number, so they weren't interested in selling it to someone without a billing number because they may have to give up their billing number in order for me to get a billing number.
The one very optimistic thing, to answer the question that you brought up, is that we recognize that this is a piece of legislation that Mr. Duick has inherited. And there has been some indication in some of the interviews that we've heard with him that he wants to meet and discuss this. And in fact, he was quoted last night in the Vancouver Sun as saying that this is not the ideal way to control costs.
I'll be talking tomorrow. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Webster,
yes.
I'm one of those young physicians that have been refused a number under this scheme, and yes, I have been unfairly treated. I, in fact, was part of Christyanne's medical school class in 1980, when the medical school enrollment increased to 120 from 100 the year before and 80 the year before that, which we thought at that point was a certain indication that we were not only wanted but very much needed. 6 years later, I now have a practice to go into in Vancouver to join my husband in practice as a family physician. I have hospital privileges, I have a letter of need from the Manpower Committee, and the government says no.
I'm beginning to be converted a little bit. 1980, they put it up from 80 to 125.
Over 2 years, from 1978 to 1980, it went from 80 to 120.
I was in the last small class at UBC, and they've increased the size of the medical school, and yet we have Dr. Wilson, who was one of the petitioners, Dr. Maxson, who's one of the petitioners. You just heard from this young doctor, all graduates from UBC, many of them who went out of the province to get extra training so that they could bring something back, and because they happened to go out when this came in, they're out of the system.
Thanks very much, Doc. Best luck. Go ahead, please.
Jack, these doctors aren't bringing the whole thing up front here.
Okay, tell you what, hold on a second. I got to take a break, and I'll come back to you as the first call. After the break. Well, I have Dr. Maxson, Dr. Conn, and Dr. Mathews, and we're talking about the court decision which refuses doctors not in the swim billing numbers. Go ahead, please.
Jack, none of these doctors have mentioned the fact that the system is running out of money. There's 2 points I want to make. First of all, I've never heard them say that doctors over 65 should retire. That would leave room for a heck of a lot more billing numbers to come out. The second point is that I think a lot of the young doctors and the older doctors, too, are afraid to diagnose. If they make a mistake or if they don't use all the latest fancy equipment that's in the hospital, they might get sued. And that costs our system a hell of a lot of money. Rather than go to one doctor, it's not unusual for a patient to be referred to 2 or 3 or 4 of them. That is the problem with our system today.
Gentlemen, madame?
He's hit the nail on the head. Healthcare costs is a problem. Except, you know, what was interesting was during the court case, because of the nature of the court case, we had to exchange information between the government and ourselves that normally isn't exchanged. We found out, and here's the surprise, if you put it into 1985 constant dollars and compare how much we spent per person on healthcare in British Columbia, in 1982 we spent $866 per person. 1986 we spent $766. We're spending less per person in constant dollars than we did before. Healthcare costs per person have gone down.
The fantastic magician, is faced with a current deficit as of the end of March. I'm talking about operating deficit for the year of $1,200,000,000, which we had to borrow to keep the province going this year. They have a problem, no doubt about it. I don't know where you get the money from.
If you're going to cut costs, then that means you're going to cut services. That's what we're talking about, is cutting services. And the way they've chosen to cut services is by taking out the doctors, preventing patients from seeing doctors. In other words, making the lineups longer. If you're going to cut costs, let's look at creative ways to cut costs.
Well, I think overutilization is a problem which some of your older colleagues would like to fix with a deterrent fee, but which to me is anathema. You know, it's because of my own bent. You could cut down the utilization with deterrent fees, couldn't you? Are any of you young doctors in favor of deterrent fees?
We're in favor of Medicare. That's the system that we think is working. You know, we've got one of the best healthcare systems in the world.
That's because it's been very generous to doctors. Socialism with fee-for-service.
It's allowed doctors to be paid for the services that they provide.
Go ahead, please.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to say that it is my democratic right to choose which doctor I would like to go to when I would like to go to him. And secondly, I'd like to say that they are my tax dollars that are out there, and I'm paying heavy, heavy taxes, and I deserve to have the choice to go to any doctor I choose to go to.
And they should get billing numbers.
Yes, they should.
Thank you, ma'am.
This lady hits the nail on the head. This lady hammers home the point that we've been trying to make, and that is that who you're harming the most, people have been concentrating on the young doctors and wanting a right to earn a living, but it's the patients that are going to suffer because they can't go and see the doctor of their choice. There are women in Kelowna that are wanting to go and see Christyanne as their physician, and they're being prevented by this law.
Is it right for the government to tell you who should be your doctor? What if you don't get along with them? What if they don't get along with you? Shouldn't you be able to choose the doctor that you prefer?
But I can do that now from among the doctors available.
What if you're in a small community in northern British Columbia where there's 2 doctors, and the government's decided there's only going to be 2 doctors, and those 2 doctors don't want to leave, and you don't like them, and you wish that there was somebody who grew up in that town that wanted to be a doctor to come back and become that doctor.
Yeah, it's a good point of freedom.
Can't come back. You don't get a chance to see that doctor.
Go ahead, please.
can you tell me if the BCAMA has any influence over billing numbers? And also, can you tell me if the lady here has, if there's preference given to BC graduate doctors? Thank you.
Good questions. BCMA, any influence over billing numbers?
I don't believe so.
Any preference to BC graduates?
None. None.
Go ahead from Kelowna.
Hello, Jack.
Yeah.
I live in Kelowna, and I came here from Alberta 4 years ago, and I haven't got a family doctor yet. I've phoned up 3 or 4 times when you've had a problem, get the flu or something like that, and they're just booked right up. They won't take any new patients. The only time I had gotten in to see a doctor was a water skiing accident, and I was going in emergency, and still he won't see me as a regular patient.
You're making a case that there's a shortage of doctors. Fair enough. Good. Next one.
That's in a community where 2 people who grew up there, and there's only about 6 people from Kelowna that have ever gone to medical school.
Are trying to practice in their hometown.
And they can't.
And they can't.
Just being told there's too many doctors already, we're sorry. You can't go home.
There's no need.
Well, if you capped it and spread the money around to different doctors.
That's one way to do it. What you do then, and I'm not going to advocate capping because I don't know enough about it, but what you do is, if you say the pie is only so big, and as many people as want to be in it are in it, you're going to have people that are going to leave because they don't like the pie, but the person's going to leave because they don't like the pie.
You're saying that competition exists in the medical profession in many communities.
Competition exists.
I hadn't really thought of that, I must tell you. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
I agree there's a great shortage of doctors in BC. I recently came here and I got quite ill. I phoned 6 or 7 doctors, and finally, a receptionist was kind enough to give me a number to call, and it was a medical association of new practitioners that were taking patients. I went to see a young fellow, and he said, I don't have the experience, and he shipped me off to St. Paul's Hospital, which they admitted me right away. Now, why won't they let more doctors practice and get more knowledgeable?
How long did you spend waiting to get in to see the doctor?
I came from Alberta, and no doctor would accept me because I didn't have a referral doctor from Alberta.
There's the bottom line. You see, if you can't get in to see a doctor, then
the doctors here don't accept new patients.
Okay, bye. Go ahead,
money.
please.
He saved money. He didn't get in to see the doctor.
He saved the government money.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yep.
Jack. I'm a third-year medical student. I'm currently, in medical school. I have not got my degree yet, so I'm one of those medical people who are on the other end of the system, or the other end of the sort of people you've seen on and heard from on TV tonight. My criticism is this. If it wasn't for mismanagement of the system, you wouldn't have the problems that we have now. I feel that the system is mismanaged in terms of the number of people they're taking in to get trained, and for the number of billing numbers that are out on the other end. I think that there is sort of a number of points around this and why the government has done what it has done. I think the government saves a lot of money by having fourth-year medical students and residents treat patients in the teaching hospitals rather than pay the wages that they would have to pay licensed doctors to pay to do this work.
No, fair enough, but what are you going to do now? You're going to finish your treatment and hope you get a billing number?
Well, it's really discouraging right now. You could imagine the atmosphere in my class, hearing all this controversy about billing numbers, and it just puts a bad light on the whole deal. We have to...
Okie dokie. Goodbye, I get your point. I don't think I have time for another call. What's the next step?
Well, we have our lawyers going over Judge Lissack's decision. It's 65 pages long. We're trying to figure out why he's interpreted the Charter of Rights different than Chief Justice McKechnie, because really that's what we've got. We've got 2 judges in the same court who looked at very similar cases and have decided different decisions, and we'll look at going for an appeal.
My thanks to Dr. Maxson, my thanks to Dr. Conn, my thanks to Dr. David Mathews. Much indeed. After the break.
Pat? Or Pamela?
Don't have time, don't worry. It's only 15 to 18 seconds. Doesn't matter.
Just a hair comb?
Haven't got time.
30 seconds back pass.
Haven't got time.
Just a quick 15 seconds. You have 18 seconds to close, Jack.
Jack.
10 seconds.
Please don't, please don't, please don't.
4.
Tomorrow we'll tackle the new Health Minister, Peter Duick, and what he thinks about the billing number. It's fairly predictable, but he might have some thoughts about meeting with the doctors. And we're going to meet the new top Labour man in BC for the first time in Webster, which is Mr. Giorgetti of the BC Fed at 5 p.m. precisely. Stay tuned for the news hour.